Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're gonna get into something that maybe sounds a little academic at first. We're talking about the Abhidhamma,
Uh-huh.
and you hear that and you think, oh, that's some ancient text locked away in a monastery somewhere. Well, stick around because we've dug up a really insightful interview, and it's with the author of the book Abhidhamma in Daily Life, Nina van Gorkom,
Right.
and and that title kind of gives away why we think this is going to be relevant for you and for me in daily life. And what makes her perspective especially interesting is she studied directly with Acharn Sujin over in Thailand. So she brings kind of a very hands-on, practical perspective to this ancient wisdom.
Yeah. And you know what we want to do in this deep dive with you is really pull out some of the core insights from her interview. Not just the abstract ideas, but the real applicable knowledge that shows us how even a very basic understanding of Abhidhamma can shift how we experience our thoughts, feelings, and even our life as a whole.
Uh-huh.
And we're not going to get bogged down in a lot of complex jargon, I promise.
Well, that's good because I don't know a lot of the complex
Yes,
jargon.
right.
So, but just to start off with, from a high level, what is the Abhidhamma about?
Well, Nina van Gorkom explains it very simply. It's an explanation of what life is.
Okay.
And so often we go through our day with the sense that there's a kind of a permanent self, like there's a you in there that's kind of coordinating everything. And the Abhidhamma presents a very different perspective. And it says that life is actually a continuous flow of these momentary realities.
Uh,
And these realities are both mental and physical, and they constantly change. They arise because of specific conditions, and here's a really key point. There is no permanent controllable self within all of this.
Okay, so instead of thinking of myself as, this kind of solid me moving through the day, I should be thinking of myself as this rapid succession of individual moments, like almost like flipping through frames of a movie really fast.
Yes, I think that's a very good analogy. For example, at this very moment, when you're seeing these words, life is that act of seeing. And when you hear a sound, life is hearing. And the Abhidhamma very meticulously breaks down everything that can be experienced through your senses and through your mind into these fleeting momentary realities.
Okay, so that's a pretty significant shift, from how most of us think about things. We tend to think of ourselves as relatively stable beings interacting with a stable world. So how did Nina van Gorkom even come to this way of understanding things? What led her to the Abhi?
Her story is actually quite relatable and maybe something that you listening have experienced. She was in Thailand and she had this feeling that there must be more to life than just the surface level of things that tend to, occupy our attention. And she encountered this teacher named Acharn Sujin, and he introduced her to this idea that Vipassana, which is really insight into the way things really are, it isn't limited to these silent meditation retreats. He taught her that you can actually develop this insight right here in the middle of your daily life.
Well, that's great because, I can't just run off to a mountaintop for months at a time.
Right. And Nina herself, she had a very full life. And so this practical approach really resonated with her. And what Acharn Sujin would do is he would point out very simple things in everyday situations. Like when we are caught up in worry, he would point out that those worries aren't some kind of a solid problem weighing us down. They're really just moments of thinking, mental phenomena.
Uh-huh.
And that led to these core concepts of nama and rupa.
Okay, Nama and Rupa, let's unpack that a little bit.
Okay, so nama refers to mental phenomena. So those are things that can experience something, our thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. And rupa refers to physical phenomena. So those are things that cannot experience anything themselves, but they can be experienced. So like your body, the chair you're sitting on, the device you're listening to this on, these are examples of rupa. And what Acharn Sujin emphasized is that these, the nama and rupa, are the fundamental building blocks of reality, not the people and the objects that we tend to focus on.
Okay.
Even our thoughts, ideas, and concepts. While they're definitely real in a certain sense, they're not real in the ultimate absolute sense. They are also just nama. They're mental realities that arise and pass away.
So instead of being consumed by some, problem at work or some problem at home, the Abhidhamma would encourage me to see that as a series of mental moments, these nama moments. And it's not this big solid thing.
Exactly. And it's interesting, Nina's journey into this understanding didn't actually begin with like intense meditation. It began with something you probably do every day, which is listening. She would read the suttas, which are the discourses of the Buddha, and she would listen to Acharn Sujin's daily radio programs.
Ah, so a daily dose of wisdom with her morning coffee.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I like it. And what was really key here, and I think something important for anyone trying to understand this, is that repetition. Acharn Sujin would explain over and over again citta, which is a moment of consciousness, and how it arises within a series. And so just by hearing this explained day after day, that really dynamic flow of consciousness started to become much clearer for Nina.
So consistent exposure to these ideas was really crucial for her understanding to develop.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just passively listening. Nina really emphasizes the importance of actively engaging with the teachings. So asking questions. She would ask Acharn Sujin a lot of questions whenever she had the opportunity. And also reflection. Acharn Sujin would often encourage her to write about the Dhamma. And the act of putting your understanding into your own words really solidifies the learning process. And, you could do that by taking notes or even just thinking about these ideas later on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If you have to write something down, it kind of forces you to process it and really articulate it in a way that just kind of listening and maybe nodding your head along doesn't. But what about, the person listening to this who might not have a teacher like Acharn Sujin readily available to ask questions of?
Yeah, that's a great point. And Nina addresses that directly. And she draws on the Buddha's own guidance on this because he consistently emphasized the importance of listening to the teachings and then considering what you've heard. And that definitely includes reading texts. But she points out that discussion is incredibly helpful. And, something like we're doing right now in this deep dive, engaging in online forums, asking questions in study groups, reflecting together with others who are also exploring these ideas. These are all really valuable tools for learning.
So it's about engaging with the material.
Yeah.
Not just passively absorbing information. Now, I know we've touched on this already a little bit, but, the Abhidhamma talks a lot about consciousness or citta.
Yeah.
How does this understanding of citta then play out in our daily life? And what we're experiencing from moment to moment?
Yeah. Before understanding the Buddha's teachings, we tend to think that there is a self, a central self, that is the one who is seeing, thinking, and feeling. But what the Abhidhamma reveals is that each moment of citta, each little flicker of consciousness that you experience, arises due to very specific conditions. For example, the visual object that's in front of you right now and your eye sense coming together, these create the conditions for seeing to occur. And it's really interesting because even that act of seeing is understood to be a result of past actions, or what we call karma.
So that beautiful sunset I saw on my way home from work today, that could be the result of some positive action I took in the past.
Exactly.
That's a nice way to think about it.
Yeah, it's a very different way to frame your everyday experience, right?
It is.
Seeing or hearing agreeable or disagreeable things, these can be understood as results of your past karma. But then there's also how you react to those experiences. That's the more active part in this present moment. You can react with wholesome consciousness or unwholesome consciousness. And even those reactions are conditioned by your past experiences, your education, your ingrained habits.
So my tendency to get a little impatient when I'm stuck in traffic isn't just some random outburst. It's actually rooted in some past conditioning, maybe something I've learned or developed over time.
Precisely. And here's where it gets really interesting, is each of these fleeting moments of consciousness, whether it's, a kind thought or an irritated thought, they leave a little imprint. They influence the very next moment. And it's like this ongoing accumulation of good and bad qualities that's being passed on in this continuous stream of consciousness. And not just within this lifetime, but potentially even beyond.
Yeah.
And then these accumulations become part of the conditions that shape how you react to future experiences. And it really makes you think about those habitual patterns of reaction that you might notice in yourself.
It does, yeah. So the Abhidhamma, as Nina put it, helps us to know ourselves, but the self that we're knowing isn't the same solid, unchanging entity that we typically imagine ourselves to be, is it?
Exactly. What we call self is really just this ever-changing flow of these moments of consciousness. And the goal isn't just to try to be more wholesome, although that's a natural outcome of understanding. The primary aim is understanding itself. It's understanding that everything, absolutely everything that arises is conditioned. It's not something we can control in the ultimate sense, but it can be understood.
So when I experience a strong emotion, like, frustration building up during a long meeting at work, the Abhidhamma is suggesting that this frustration has arisen due to a specific set of conditions. It's not because I'm a frustrated person at my core.
Exactly. Reactions like attachment and aversion, they arise naturally, but by understanding them as these conditioned non-self elements, we can start to relate to difficult emotions in a different way without completely identifying with them. It creates a bit of mental space, a bit of detachment, which can be really helpful in navigating difficult situations.
That sounds really helpful for, just managing those everyday emotional ups and downs. Now, Nina also talks about feelings and emotions from this Abhidhamma perspective, and it's quite different from our usual understanding of my feelings.
Yeah, we often focus so much on my feelings, my problems, right? Like, there's this strong sense of self-involvement.
Hmm.
But in the Abhidhamma, feeling or Vedana is understood as a mental factor. It's a Chitasika.
Yeah.
And it accompanies every single moment of sati. And its function is simply to taste the object.
To taste the
Yeah,
object.
yeah.
That's a very immediate way to put it.
It is. And there's three types of feeling. So there's pleasant, unpleasant, and indifferent or neutral. And what Nina points out is that even in these moments where you think there's no particular feeling present, like just seeing something very ordinary, there's actually indifferent feeling occurring. And it's so fleeting that we barely even notice it,
Yeah.
But this feeling, this Vedana, is a reality in each moment of consciousness. But it's quite different from what we conventionally consider emotions, which we think of as these big lasting things. We often get really attached to our ideas about feeling. But the Abhidhamma shows us that it's just this satasika, this mental factor, that arises and disappears immediately.
So when I'm stuck in what feels like a really big problem, the Abhidhamma perspective
Yeah.
is that this is really just, moments of thinking accompanied by mental factors like aversion. And these too are inherently impermanent.
Exactly. And we often think that we can control those problems, how they resolve. But Nina shares a personal anecdote that's very interesting. She was really worried about certain travel arrangements, and then they ultimately resolved themselves in completely unexpected ways, which highlights this lack of control that we often have. And she also talks about her friend Sarah, who shortly after a traumatic accident was able to offer these incredibly helpful words of wisdom. And what's interesting is Sarah didn't even consciously remember saying those words. And this really illustrates how these wholesome states of mind, these kusala sittas, can lead to really beneficial actions that arise almost spontaneously. It's not something that we're, deliberately controlling.
Wow, that's a really powerful example of how these fleeting states of mind can have, tangible effects in the real world.
Nina also touches on, our very common desire for agreeable emotions and also our very common experience of fear. So how does the Abhidhamma help us to understand these aspects of our daily life? Well, our disappointment when agreeable emotions don't last or they don't meet our expectations really stems from this misunderstanding of control. We think we should be able to dictate our emotional landscape, but we can't.
Right.
And regarding fear, Nina really emphasizes this crucial point, which is that the Buddha's teachings should lead to less of a burden, not increased anxiety.
Uh-huh.
So fear, from an Abhidhamma perspective, it's simply another mental reality. It's not self or mine. And recognizing this inherent uncertainty of what's going to happen next can actually be quite freeing.
Hmm. So instead of, trying to fight off that feeling of fear or wish it away, we can learn to observe it as just another conditioned mental event
Yeah.
that is passing through.
Exactly. And Nina brings up this concept of sati, which is often translated as mindfulness or alertness. But she cautions against misinterpretations of this word alertness.
Why is that? It seems like, being alert and aware in the present moment would be a positive thing.
Yeah, it's true. But sometimes when we hear that word alertness, it can imply that there's a separate you. Uh-huh.
Who's actively observing
Right.
and then making judgments about whether or not an experience is wholesome or unwholesome.
Got it.
But sati, in the Abhidhamma context, is actually a chitasika. It's one of these mental factors that arises with wholesome citta, with wholesome consciousness. And it's characterized by non-forgetfulness of what is wholesome.
Non-forgetfulness of what is wholesome. Can you give us like an example so we can understand that a little bit better?
Yeah, sure. So imagine you have an opportunity to help someone in need, but you're feeling a bit lazy or tired,
Yeah.
and you're kind of inclined to just keep to yourself. If sati arises because the conditions are right for it to arise, it will remember the wholesomeness of helping, that positive impact that it would have. And that can then lead you to take the helpful action. So that's just one example.
There's also more developed levels of sati that involve recognizing the benefit of understanding all these different realities, seeing, thinking, attachment, and so on. But the crucial point here is that it's sati itself, this conditioned mental factor that is doing the recognizing, not some separate willful you.
Okay.
And importantly, sati arises because certain conditions are present. It's not something that we can just force into being through effort.
So it's less about, me trying harder to be mindful and more about cultivating the right conditions in my life for sati to arise more naturally.
Exactly. And Nina really helpfully outlines 4 key conditions for developing understanding, which then can support the arising of sati. The first one is listening to the teachings. And that can be, as we said, through discussions or through reading. The second is really considering what you've heard, so not just letting it wash over you, but really reflecting on it throughout the day. The third is applying these teachings in your daily life. You don't need a special retreat to start noticing these things. You can contemplate the nature of your thoughts and feelings while you're doing everyday tasks. And then the fourth is confidence, having confidence in the Buddha's words and the possibility of developing understanding.
These are all really practical steps that anyone listening can start to, incorporate into their daily routine. Nina also draws a distinction between establishing sati and developing understanding. What's the key difference there?
So she cautions against this idea that we need to actively establish sati through really forceful techniques.
Okay.
Its arising, as we discussed, depends on conditions. What she emphasizes as most important is cultivating understanding. Understanding the nature of all these different moments of consciousness, the citta and physical phenomena, the rupa, that make up our experience. And this understanding itself can then condition a more direct, intuitive understanding of reality through what's called satipatthana, the foundations of mindfulness. And then finally, she offers this really crucial piece of advice, which is be wary of having expectations about your progress, because expectations themselves are a form of attachment, and they can actually hinder the very understanding that we're seeking.
That's a really good reminder to approach this with, openness and curiosity rather than trying to achieve some specific outcome. So bringing it all together, what's the core message here about why the Abhidhamma, as Nina van Gorkom explains it, is actually relevant for our daily lives?
The key takeaway is that the Abhidhamma provides this really powerful framework for understanding the constantly changing nature of our experience and the fundamental absence of a permanent controlling self.
Right.
And by recognizing that our thoughts, our feelings, and our reactions are just these conditioned moments that arise and pass away, we can start to observe them with a lot more detachment, with less identification. And the ultimate aim isn't to suppress, the so-called negative states, but to understand their true nature, which is that they are not self. They're just impersonal phenomena.
So it's about, seeing my own life as this continuous dynamic process rather than getting caught up in the feeling that this is me and this is my solid, unchanging reality.
Precisely. And that shift in perspective, that deeper understanding of how things actually are, can be so liberating. It can really lead to less clinging, less suffering.
So here's something for you to consider as you go about the rest of your day. Think about, one seemingly strong emotion that you have or a really deeply held belief. How might understanding it as a series of, conditioned mental moments rather than an inherent fixed part of you shift your relationship to it? Just something to, chew on for the rest of the day.
That's a great point.
Well, thank you for taking this deep dive into the Abhidhamma with us today.
And thank you for listening and exploring this, fascinating and ultimately really practical topic with us.
We've really just kind of scratched the surface here. There are so many more layers to explore.
Absolutely.
And if you find yourself interested in learning more about the Abhidhamma, don't hesitate to do a little research on your own. You might be surprised at what you find.